In 1882, a schoolteacher in rural Pennsylvania began keeping a private journal. He was supposed to be teaching a normal 11-year-old boy, but the child who walked into his classroom stood almost 7 feet tall, weighed close to 300 pounds, and described cities and machines that nobody else had ever heard of. His name was Aldrich Bramwell. By the time Aldrich turned 12, his teacher had filled 4 notebooks with what the boy called the Old World. Then Aldrich stopped speaking entirely. If hidden histories like this are what you came for, hit the subscribe button before we go any further. We dig into the stories that mainstream history has buried, and a new one drops every week. Now back to Aldrich. The town of Beech Hollow sat about 30 miles northwest of Pittsburgh, tucked into a valley that had seen better days. Coal smoke from the mills always hung in the lower air. In 1882, the population was somewhere around 420 people. There was 1 church, 1 general store, 1 blacksmith, and 1 schoolhouse. The schoolteacher's name was Ezra Holcomb. He was 62 years old, a widower, and he had been teaching the children of Beech Hollow for nearly 30 years. Holcomb was not a man given to fantasy. His journals from before the Bramwell year, which still survive in the Allegheny Historical Archive, read like ledgers. He recorded attendance, grades, weather, and the occasional note about a parent who had failed to pay his small annual stipend. There is nothing in the early years to suggest a man with a wild imagination, and nothing to suggest he believed in anything other than what he could see with his own eyes. He was Methodist, but not devout. He attended church on Christmas and Easter. He kept a small garden behind his house, which sat on a 1/4-acre lot near the schoolhouse. He read the Pittsburgh papers when he could get them, usually a week or 2 late, and he subscribed to a single periodical, a teacher's almanac that came out twice a year. He had no living children, no close relatives in the area, and only 2 friends, both older men who would die within the decade. By every account that survives, he was a man who had quietly accepted that his life was going to end exactly where it had begun, and that there were no more surprises coming for him. That changed when the Bramwells came to Beech Hollow in the autumn of 1879. Nobody could quite say where the family had come from. They bought the old Henley place on the eastern edge of town, paid in cash, and kept to themselves. The father, Cornelius Bramwell, was a tall man with a hard face and a quiet voice. The mother, whose name appears in records only as Mrs. Bramwell, was rarely seen in town. And there was the boy, Aldrich, who at 8 years old was already taller than most grown men in Beech Hollow. There were 2 other children, both girls, both also unusually large for their ages. The Bramwells did not attend church. They did not socialize with neighbors. They bought what they needed and went home. For 2 years this was the extent of what anyone in Beech Hollow knew about them. There were rumours, of course. There always were in small towns. Some people said the Bramwells were the orphans of a circus family and had run away after a fire. Some said they were related to the Cardiff giant hoax of 1869 and had gone into hiding when the hoax was exposed. Some, more darkly, said the children were not human, that the parents had found them somewhere or made them somehow, and that this was why the family kept to itself. None of these rumours ever reached the Bramwells directly, as far as anyone knew. The family simply lived in the old Henley place and did not give the town anything to talk about beyond their size. Then in late September of 1881, Cornelius Bramwell came to the schoolhouse and asked Ezra Holcomb if his son could be tutored privately. The boy was 11 years old. The father said the boy had been homeschooled until then, but his mother could no longer keep up with his questions. He offered to pay double the standard rate in cash on the condition that Aldrich would be taught alone in the afternoons after the other children had gone home. Holcomb agreed. He needed the money. His own son had died of consumption 7 years earlier, and there was no widow's pension for a man who had outlived everyone. Aldrich Bramwell came to the schoolhouse for the first time on the 3rd of October, 1881. Holcomb's journal entry from that evening is the first in what would become known as the Bramwell notebooks. He wrote that the boy was the largest child he had ever seen, and that the boy moved with a kind of careful slowness, as if he were always afraid of breaking something. He wrote that the boy's eyes were a pale grey colour and seemed older than his face. He wrote that when Aldrich sat down at one of the schoolhouse desks, the desk groaned under his weight, and the boy apologised in a quiet, almost adult voice. Holcomb planned to start with reading, because most homeschooled boys from these rural areas were behind in reading. But within 10 minutes he realised Aldrich was reading several years ahead of what was expected. So he tried arithmetic. Same result. The boy had been taught well. By the end of the first afternoon, Holcomb had no idea what to teach him. He asked the boy what he was interested in. Aldrich said he wanted to learn about the world as it is now. He wanted to know what the world remembered. Holcomb wrote in his journal that night that he found the phrasing strange. What the world remembered. As if memory belonged to the world itself, and not to people. The second lesson was on the 5th of October. Holcomb had brought a globe down from the high shelf in the back of the schoolhouse. He thought maybe geography would interest the boy. He asked Aldrich to point to where he had been born. Aldrich stared at the globe for a long time. Then he asked if he could draw a different one. Holcomb gave him a sheet of paper and a pencil. What Aldrich drew, according to the journal, was not a globe at all. It was a flat map, oval-shaped, with landmasses Holcomb did not recognise. There was a long continent across the top, a smaller one in the middle, and the rest was a strange scatter of islands and seas that did not match anything in any atlas Holcomb owned. In the very centre of the map, Aldrich drew a large city ringed by walls and surrounded by what he called the singing fields. Holcomb asked him what the singing fields were. Aldrich said they were the towers that gave the cities their voice. He said when the towers stopped singing, the cities went dark. Holcomb tried to redirect the lesson. He showed the boy a real atlas. Aldrich looked through it slowly, page by page. When he was done, he said in that quiet adult voice that this was a different world. He said it was thinner. He said most of what had been there before was gone, and the people who lived now had forgotten that it had ever existed. Holcomb wrote that night that the boy was either suffering from a serious delusion or had been taught some kind of religious doctrine he did not understand. He decided to be cautious. He would not contradict the boy. He would record what was said and try to understand it later. The lessons continued through October and into November. Each afternoon, Aldrich came to the schoolhouse, sat at the reinforced bench Holcomb had built for him, and spoke about what he called the old world. He talked about cities built of a stone that glowed faintly in the dark. He said the stone was quarried from places where lightning had struck deep into the earth for thousands of years and left the rock charged with what he called skyfire. He said the great buildings of his old world were never lit by lamps because they did not need to be. The walls themselves gave off light. He talked about bells that hung in the highest towers. He said the bells were not for telling time. He said they were for keeping the air clean. He said when the bells rang, sickness left the city and food kept longer in the cellars and people slept without dreams. He said the bells had to be tuned to the right note and that there were men whose only job was to walk from tower to tower and listen. He talked about roads that moved. He said in his old world there were certain streets where you did not have to walk. You stepped onto the stones and the stones carried you. He said it had something to do with the way the road was built, layer over layer, with metal between every layer of stone and a current running through. He talked about water that ran uphill. He said the great cities had fountains at their highest points, and the water flowed up from underground rivers to feed them, and the engineers who built the fountains were called the lifters. Holcomb wrote in his journal that he could not tell whether the boy was making any of this up. The boy did not seem to be inventing as he spoke. He spoke about the bells and the roads and the lifters the way another child might speak about the wagon his father owned, or the dog that lived under the porch. He spoke about them like they had been ordinary. In mid-November, Holcomb did something he later regretted. He asked Aldrich where this old world had been. The boy looked at him for a long time. Then he said in that quiet voice that it had been here. It had been everywhere. He said the world had been one country once, and all the cities had been part of it, and the country was called by a name he was not sure he should say aloud. Holcomb asked him to write it down. The boy wrote a single word on a piece of paper. The paper has not survived. The word, as Holcomb copied it later into his journal, was Tartar, with a long mark over the first vowel and a slightly different ending that he could not quite render. He noted that the boy seemed afraid after writing it, and that he asked Holcomb to burn the paper, and that Holcomb did so. That night Holcomb went home and pulled down his old atlases. He found references to Tartary, but they were vague. The 18th century map showed it as a vast region across northern Asia. The 19th century maps showed it shrinking, then disappearing, replaced by the names of provinces and republics. Holcomb wrote in his journal that he had always assumed Tartary was just an old word for the territory that became Russia. But the boy had spoken of it as if it had been a single nation, with its own language and laws and engineers and bell tuners, and had said that nation had stretched from one ocean to the other. The lessons continued. In December, Aldrich began to talk about what he called the long ending. He said his old world did not fall in a single day. He said it ended over a long time, slowly, in waves. He said first the bell stopped, then the stones stopped glowing, then the roads went silent. He said the people who remembered how to fix any of it grew old and died, and they were not replaced because the schools that had taught them had been closed by what he called the new men. Holcomb asked who the new men were. The boy said the new men were the ones who decided what the world would be allowed to remember. He said the new men did not destroy the cities. They simply built new things on top of them. They buried the old wonders under streets and houses and called the streets and houses original. He said in the cities of his old world you could dig down 20 feet and find a road, dig down 40 feet and find another, dig down 80 feet and find the foundations of buildings that no one alive had ever heard of. Holcomb wrote that this was the moment he started to wonder if the boy was telling the truth. He had been to Philadelphia twice in his life. He had seen the construction crews. He had heard the workers tell stories of finding old walls and old wells and old paving stones 40 feet down where there should have been nothing but dirt. He had always assumed those workers were exaggerating, or that they were finding the remains of forgotten farms. He went home that night and wrote a single sentence. He wrote, "I do not know what this child is." There is one entry from this period that researchers have argued over for decades. It is dated the 19th of December, 1881. Holcomb wrote that Aldrich had spoken about an event that was going to happen in Chicago in about 11 years. The boy said there would be a great fair with white buildings and electric lights, and the people who came to see it would believe they were looking at the future. But the boy said the buildings of this fair would not be permanent. They would be made of plaster and lath, designed to be torn down after a season. He said the real buildings, the ones the fair was imitating, had stood for thousands of years in his old world, and had been made of stone that glowed. Holcomb wrote that he did not understand what the boy meant. He had not heard of any planned fair in Chicago. There was no public announcement of such an event in 1881. The World's Columbian Exposition, which featured the famous White City and which opened in Chicago in 1893, was not formally proposed until 1885 and not approved by Congress until 1890. If Aldrich was inventing the description, he invented it before any record of the fair existed. If he was remembering it, the question of how becomes very difficult to answer. Holcomb did not draw any conclusion in his journal. He simply recorded what the boy said. The boy turned 12 on the 14th of January, 1882. Holcomb gave him a small gift, a leather notebook with blank pages. He told the boy he could use it to write down whatever he wanted to remember. Aldrich thanked him in his quiet voice, and that afternoon he sat at his reinforced bench and began to draw. The drawings have not survived. Holcomb copied some of them into his own journal, badly, in pencil. The copies are the only record. They show domed buildings the size of cathedrals, with towers rising from their corners, and what looked like antennae of some kind reaching from the highest points. They show streets lined with what Holcomb labelled as light trees, tall, thin poles with bulbs at their tops. They show wheeled vehicles that do not match anything Holcomb would have seen in 1882. They show structures that look like the star-shaped fortresses found in old European cities, but Aldrich drew them in places where no fortress should be. In the middle of plains, in the middle of forests, in the middle of what Holcomb knew to be empty land. Aldrich kept drawing through the rest of January. He drew the cities his old world had lost. He drew them carefully, slowly, the same way he moved through the schoolhouse. He labelled some of the drawings with names. The names were strange. None of them matched any city Holcomb knew. But years later, after Holcomb was dead, after the notebooks had been hidden and forgotten and finally rediscovered, a researcher in the 1970s would notice that several of the names on Aldrich's drawings appeared on certain 17th century maps. They appeared as cities in Tartary. By the 18th century, those names had vanished from every map. In late January, Aldrich began to slow down. Holcomb wrote that the boy seemed tired all the time. He spoke less, he drew less. He came to the schoolhouse, sat at his bench and stared at the window. Holcomb asked him what was wrong. The boy said the memory was leaving. He said he could feel it going out of him. He said he had been holding it for a long time, and now it was going. Holcomb pressed him. He asked what memory. The boy looked at him and said the memory of who he had been before. Holcomb wrote in his journal that night that he believed the boy thought he had lived before, in the old world, and that he was forgetting that life now. He wrote that he did not know what to do with this. He wrote that the boy had never lied to him about anything, never once, and that everything the boy had said had been consistent with everything else, and that this consistency was either the mark of a brilliant fantasist or the mark of a truth Holcomb was not equipped to understand. On the 3rd of February, a man Holcomb had never seen came to Beech Hollow. He was well dressed, with a long coat and a black hat, and he carried a small leather case. He went directly to the schoolhouse during the boys' lesson. He did not knock. He stood in the doorway and watched. Holcomb asked who he was. The man said he had been sent by certain interested parties in Philadelphia to evaluate the boy. He did not say what interested parties. He did not give a name. He stayed for the rest of the lesson, watching Aldrich draw, taking notes in his own small book. When the lesson ended, the man left without speaking to Holcomb or to the boy. That night, Holcomb wrote in his journal that he had a bad feeling. He wrote that he should hide the notebooks. He did not say why. The man came back 3 days later. This time he spoke with Cornelius Bramwell at the Bramwell house. The conversation lasted several hours. The next morning the Bramwells did not come to the schoolhouse. Holcomb walked out to the old Henley place. The house was empty. The furniture was still there. The food was still on the kitchen table. But the Bramwells were gone, and no one in Beech Hollow ever saw them again. Holcomb made one final entry in his journal that week. He wrote that he had taken the notebooks and hidden them in a place no one would think to look. He wrote that he was afraid for the boy. He wrote that he believed the boy had been telling the truth about everything, and that the boy had been taken by people who did not want what the boy knew to spread. Then for years Holcomb's journal entries returned to what they had been before: attendance, grades, weather, stipends. He never mentioned Aldrich Bramwell again, not even once, for the next 25 years of his life. Ezra Holcomb died in 1907. His estate was small. His desk, a heavy oak roll-top that had belonged to his grandfather, was sold at auction along with the rest of his possessions. The desk passed through 3 owners over the next 6 decades. In 1971 it ended up in a furniture shop in Pittsburgh. The shop owner was refinishing it when he noticed that one of the drawers did not extend all the way back. He pulled the drawer out and reached into the cavity behind it. He pulled out 4 leather notebooks and a stack of loose pages. The notebooks were Ezra Holcomb's. The loose pages were copies of Aldrich Bramwell's drawings. The shop owner did not know what he had. He showed them to his nephew, who was studying at Carnegie Mellon. The nephew showed them to a history professor. The professor said the journal entries appeared genuine, that the handwriting was consistent with the period, that the paper was correct for the 1880s, and that the names of the people mentioned could be checked against the census. They could be checked. Ezra Holcomb was real. He had taught at the Beach Hollow Schoolhouse for 31 years. He had died in 1907, as the journal entries suggested. The Bramwell family appeared on the 1880 census as residents of Beach Hollow, Pennsylvania. The father was listed as Cornelius Bramwell, occupation unknown. The mother was listed only as Mrs. Bramwell. The son was listed as Aldrich Bramwell, age 9, with a notation in the enumerator's hand reading larger than average. The 2 daughters were listed as well. By the 1890 census, the Bramwells were no longer in Beach Hollow. They did not appear in any other census in Pennsylvania or in any neighboring state. They did not appear in any death records. They did not appear in any cemetery. According to every public record that has been searched, the Bramwell family simply ceased to exist after early 1882, which matches the timing of their disappearance in Holcomb's journal. The researcher who eventually took the Holcomb notebooks for serious study was a woman named Margaret Sayers, an independent historian based in Boston. She worked with the materials for almost 12 years, from 1976 until her death in 1988. She tried to find any trace of Aldrich Bramwell after February of 1882. She tried to find any record of the well-dressed man with the long coat. She tried to find any government correspondence from Philadelphia in 1882 that mentioned a child being taken into any kind of custody. She found nothing. What she did find were the 17th century maps. She found that several of the city names Aldrich had drawn appeared on Dutch and French maps from the 1640s and 1650s in regions labelled as Grand Tartary. She found that these cities were no longer marked on any map after about 1750. She could find no historical record of their existence other than those early maps. She could find no record of their destruction. They simply stopped being marked, the way a person who has died is no longer listed in a directory. One of the most striking matches she found was a name Aldrich had written under one of his drawings of a domed building. The name was Camberloo. Sayers traced this to a Dutch map from 1652 by the cartographer Joan Bleu, where a city called Camberloo appeared in northern Tartary, marked with the symbol Bleu used for capital cities. By 1720, the city was no longer on any map. There is no record of when it was founded, no record of when it was abandoned, no record of any king or governor who ever ruled it. The city exists in the 17th century, and then it does not, and no historian can tell you what happened in between. Aldrich had drawn the domes of Camberloo in his notebook. He had labelled them with what he said were their functions. One dome was for storing grain. One was for healing the sick. One was for what he called the singers, which Sayers eventually understood to mean the men who maintained the great bells. One dome, the largest, he labelled simply with a word that Holcomb had transcribed phonetically. The word was anesthe. Sayers spent 3 years trying to find a translation. She never did. She also tried to verify the architectural details Aldrich had drawn. She found that several of the structures the boy had drawn matched with surprising accuracy photographs of buildings that had been demolished in the late 19th and early 20th centuries during what was then called urban renewal. Buildings in places like Chicago, St. Louis, San Francisco, Detroit. Buildings that had been built before the cities around them existed, according to local records, and that had been torn down because their original purpose was no longer known. One example she focused on was a building in Detroit called the Hammond, demolished in 1956. It had been built in the 1860s according to city records, but the architect was never named, and the foundation had been laid on top of an older foundation that no one could account for. Photographs of the Hammond show a series of small spires along its roofline, and a large central dome with a thin metal rod rising from its peak. Sayers compared these photographs to one of Aldrich's drawings. The match was almost exact. The drawing predated the demolition by 74 years, and predated any public photograph of the Hammond by at least a decade. Sayers spent the last years of her life trying to publish what she had found. No academic press would touch it. No popular publisher would either. The notebooks were too strange, the implications too uncomfortable, the evidence too circumstantial. When she died in 1988, the notebooks went to her sister, who kept them in a safe deposit box for almost 2 decades. In 2007, the sister donated them anonymously to a private archive in Vermont, where they remain today. The full content of the notebooks has never been published. What we have are the excerpts Sayers transcribed in her research notes, which were donated separately to a university in upstate New York, and the photographs she took of some of the pages, which a researcher named David Aylin made available online in 2014. Aylin is the one who first connected Aldrich's testimony to the broader body of research that has come to be called the Lost Empire, or the Great Forgetting, or simply Tartaria. There is one final detail from the notebooks that we have not yet mentioned. In the last surviving journal entry that references Aldrich Bramwell, dated the 4th of February 1882, Ezra Holcomb wrote that the boy had told him something on his last day of lessons. The boy had said that he did not expect to remember anything from this morning by the end of the week. He had said the memory was almost gone. But there was one thing he wanted Holcomb to write down in case it was ever needed. The boy said, and Holcomb wrote the words exactly, that the old world was not destroyed. It was buried. He said it was still there, under everything, and that one day the burying would stop and the cities would be uncovered again. He said the towers would sing. He said the bells would ring. He said the stones would glow. He said he did not know when this would happen. But he said it would happen, because forgetting was not the same as deleting, and the world remembered itself even when the people who lived on it did not. That was the last thing Aldrich Bramwell said to Ezra Holcomb, as far as we know. The next day the well-dressed man came back to the Bramwell house. The day after that, the Bramwells were gone. What do we do with a story like this? The skeptical answer is the easy one. We say that Ezra Holcomb was a lonely, recently bereaved widower in a small town in rural Pennsylvania, and he invented an elaborate story to give himself something to think about in the long winter evenings. We say the boy never existed, or that he was a real child with some unusual height condition and a strong imagination, and Holcomb filled in the rest. We say the census records match because someone made them match, or because the Bramwells were real but ordinary people who moved away for ordinary reasons. We say the drawings are forgeries planted in the desk decades later by a hoaxer who knew the desk would eventually be sold. This is the easy answer. It explains everything. It requires no rethinking of history. But there is a harder answer. The harder answer is that Ezra Holcomb was exactly what he appears to have been. A careful, sober, unimaginative man who recorded what he saw because he did not know what else to do with it. The harder answer is that Aldrich Bramwell was exactly what he appears to have been. A child, unusually large, who carried with him some kind of memory that did not belong to him, and that whatever that memory was, it described a world that does not appear in our textbooks, and does not match anything in our official histories. The harder answer asks us to accept that the boy might have been telling the truth, that somewhere under our feet, under the streets and the suburbs and the highways, there are roads we never built and walls we never raised, that somewhere in the 17th century the maps showed cities that we cannot account for, that something happened slowly over decades or centuries that erased a previous order so thoroughly that we now find its bones occasionally in our basements and our subway tunnels and our well shafts, and we do not know what to call them, so we do not call them anything at all. The harder answer is not a conclusion. It is a question. It is the question Aldrich Bramwell asked Ezra Holcomb at the start of their very first lesson, when the boy said he wanted to know what the world remembered. He was not asking what the world had been told. He was asking what the world itself, in its stones and its layers and its forgotten foundations, still carried in its bones. What did Aldrich Bramwell say about the old world at 12? He said it was still there. He said it was waiting. He said the bells would ring again. He said this in February of 1882, in a one-room schoolhouse outside Pittsburgh, to an old teacher who did not know what to do with what he had heard, and who kept the words safe for the rest of his life in a hidden drawer in a desk that nobody opened until 90 years later. We have his words now. What we do with them is up to us. If you made it to the end, you're exactly the kind of person we made this channel for. There is another video on screen right now that goes even deeper into the maps of 17th century Tartary and the cities that vanished from them. Click it and keep going. The forgetting only works on the people who let it. One last thing before you go. The notebooks in the Vermont archive have one page that has never been transcribed and never been photographed. The archivist who oversees the collection has confirmed it exists, but has refused all requests to see it. The reason given is that it contains, in Holcomb's handwriting, a request that the page never be read by anyone who did not personally know Aldrich Bramwell. Holcomb wrote this in 1882, and as far as anyone knows, no person living today ever knew Aldrich. So the page sits in its envelope, in its folder, in its box, sealed by the wish of a dead schoolteacher who waited his entire life for someone to come looking. Whatever Aldrich told him on that last page, Holcomb kept. And so do we, for now, until someone finds a reason to break a promise made by a man who never broke one in his life.